Tom Cruise and Katie Holmes were once the couple Hollywood couldn't stop talking about, the kind of pairing that felt scripted, almost too perfect for real life, the sort of romance tabloid editors dream about because it seemed to write its own headlines. But somewhere between a rooftop declaration of love in Paris and a courtroom filing 11 years later, something broke, quietly at first, and then all at once. And the person who's carried the weight of that fracture the longest isn't Tom, and it isn't Katie. It's their daughter. For more than a decade, Suri Cruise has grown up almost entirely out of her father's orbit, raised instead inside a quiet, tightly guarded world built by her mother. A world defined less by fame and more by privacy, routine, and the kind of ordinary childhood that seemed almost impossible given who her parents were. Now that she's turned 18, she's made a choice that says more about where her loyalty lies than any tabloid headline ever could. A choice so understated that it barely resembled news at all, and yet it traveled everywhere within days. To understand why that choice landed the way it did, you have to go back to where this all started, to a relationship that looked like a fairy tale on the outside, and by most accounts felt like something far more complicated on the inside, complicated in ways that wouldn't fully surface until years after the cameras stopped flashing at their engagement announcement. Katie Holmes came into Tom Cruise's life already familiar with his image, already shaped by the kind of admiration most people only form from a distance. She told a teen magazine years earlier, as a wide-eyed young actress just beginning to find her footing in Hollywood, that he was practically her dream man, long before the two ever crossed paths in person, long before either of them could have imagined how tangled their lives would eventually become. When their romance began, following the end of her engagement to another actor, she wasn't just falling for a movie star. She was stepping into a world governed by rules she'd never had to navigate before, chief among them Cruise's deep, decades-long devotion to Scientology, a devotion that had shaped nearly every serious relationship in his adult life up to that point. Reports over the years suggested that some of his prior partners, including Nicole Kidman, struggled with how much the church influenced their private lives, creating friction that reportedly contributed to the end of that marriage. Multiple accounts from former members have also described a vetting culture around who Cruise dated, with the church allegedly playing a role in identifying potential partners who would also embrace its belief system, a process that some sources say involved close monitoring of candidates being considered. Some of the actresses named in connection with those rumors, including Scarlett Johansson, publicly and firmly denied ever being part of that process, calling the suggestion insulting. Whatever the full truth behind those claims, one thing was consistent across nearly every account. Being with Tom Cruise meant, in some form, being with Scientology too, whether a partner arrived already devoted to the faith or came to it gradually, the way Katie eventually did. And Katie Holmes, without much public preparation or warning, was about to find that out in real time, under the glare of more cameras than almost any young actress in America had ever faced at once. Her every expression scrutinized before she'd even had time to understand what she'd stepped into. Their relationship became a cultural moment in 2005, when Cruise appeared on a daytime talk show and delivered one of the most replayed pieces of television of the decade, jumping on the host's couch, practically vibrating with excitement as he declared his feelings for Holmes to a stunned but good-humored studio audience. It divided viewers instantly, and in a way, it never really stopped dividing them. Some saw raw, uncalculated joy, a man so overwhelmed by love that he couldn't contain himself. Others saw a performance that felt unsettling in its intensity, especially once it started overshadowing the film he was there to promote in the first place, a big-budget summer release that briefly became an afterthought in the coverage. That divide would end up mirroring the way the public processed their entire relationship for years afterward, one half charmed by the spectacle, the other increasingly uneasy about what it might be covering up. Months later, Cruise proposed at the top of the Eiffel Tower, an image so cinematic it barely needed embellishment, and by the end of the year the couple was expecting their first child together. Cruise's public enthusiasm about monitoring the pregnancy himself, including purchasing his own sonogram equipment so he could check on the baby's development at home, drew concern from medical professionals who noted publicly that this kind of monitoring should be left strictly to trained specialists, not enthusiastic first-time fathers with access to expensive equipment. Then, in April 2006, Suri was born under conditions influenced directly by Scientology teachings, a quiet delivery, free of sound, based on the belief that noise during childbirth could cause harm to both mother and child. It was one of the first visible moments where the outside world got a genuine glimpse of just how deeply the church's doctrine would shape Suri's earliest days on earth. Before she'd even opened her eyes to the world she was born into, a world already fascinated with her, before she had a name. Katie's parents, devout Catholics from Ohio, had reservations from the very beginning, reservations that had little to do with Tom as a person and everything to do with the world he was asking their daughter to step into. Those concerns nearly kept them from attending the couple's lavish Italian wedding altogether. A wedding reportedly costing millions of dollars and staged inside a centuries-old castle. In the days leading up to the ceremony, rumors swirled that Katie's parents might simply stay home rather than watch their daughter marry into a belief system so far removed from the one they'd raised her in. In the end, they chose to attend, and Katie's father delivered a heartfelt toast at the rehearsal dinner despite his private hesitations, a gesture that seemed to say he was choosing his daughter's happiness over his own discomfort, at least for one night. The ceremony itself blended old Hollywood glamour with the unmistakable imprint of Scientology tradition, right down to unconventional vows that focused less on romance and more on practical devotion. Promises about providing for basic needs rather than the usual declarations of eternal passion. Guests who attended described the entire affair as something out of a dream, almost too elaborate to feel entirely real. The kind of night that photographs beautifully but leaves observers wondering what's happening underneath the surface. It was beautiful by every guest's account, and also, in hindsight, one of the earliest signs that this marriage would operate by a very different set of rules than most. Rules that outsiders would only gradually come to understand. Within a few years, people close to the couple began noticing changes in Katie that were hard to ignore once you started looking for them. Friends and journalists who'd known her before the relationship described her demeanor shifting, more guarded, more scripted in interviews, more distant from the spontaneous, chatty young actress she'd once been on morning talk shows. A journalist who dined with the couple in 2010 recalled Katie mentioning, almost offhandedly, how rarely they left the house at all anymore, a detail that read differently in hindsight than it might have at the time. Other reporters who'd interviewed her years earlier for teen magazines noted how mechanical her public praise of Cruz had become. The same compliments repeated, so often they started to sound rehearsed rather than felt. Whatever was happening behind closed doors, the woman appearing in public increasingly seemed like someone performing contentment rather than living it. And the people who'd known her longest were the first to notice the difference. Then, after 5 years of marriage, Katie made the decision that no one, including Tom, saw coming, at least not according to his own later account of events. In June 2012, she filed for divorce, a move Cruz later admitted blindsided him completely, landing just weeks before his 50th birthday, a milestone he'd apparently expected to spend very differently. He later reflected publicly on how disorienting the timing felt, describing the strange collision of turning 50 while his marriage was simultaneously ending, and admitting that maintaining a sense of humor became necessary just to get through it. But while the split stunned him personally, it was handled with remarkable speed and precision, largely because Katie's father, an experienced attorney, had negotiated an extensive prenuptial agreement years earlier, one reportedly detailed enough to fill several boxes of paperwork long before the wedding ever took place. That preparation meant the divorce was finalized in just 11 days, a stunningly fast resolution for a case with this much public attention and money attached to it, especially compared to the drawn-out, multi-year battles that typically define celebrity divorces of this size. Financially, Katie walked away with far less than Cruz's estimated fortune might have suggested to outside observers. An annual child support arrangement worth roughly $400,000 a year until Suri turned 18, along with Cruz agreeing to cover additional costs, like medical expenses separately. But money was never really the point of the negotiation, and most people close to the situation understood that from the start. The point was custody. Katie secured sole custody of Suri, giving her full control over decisions involving her daughter's upbringing, education, and religious exposure going forward. Control that many believe she prioritized over a larger settlement precisely because it mattered more to to her long-term peace of mind. In a later deposition, Cruz was directly asked whether Holmes had left him specifically to protect Suri from Scientology. He rejected the framing as offensive, insisting no one needed protection from his faith, but he confirmed it was a reason Katie herself had given during their private discussions, and he acknowledged, notably, that Suri was not being raised within the church's practices at all. For many watching from the outside, that single admission said more about the marriage's undoing than anything else that came out during the entire divorce proceeding. What followed was over a decade of near-total separation between Cruz and his youngest child, a stretch of time long enough for Suri to go from a 6-year-old learning to read to an 18-year-old choosing a college. According to multiple entertainment outlets, father and daughter have not been seen together publicly since the divorce, a gap during which Cruz built out entire film franchises, piloted helicopters for his own action sequences, and reportedly worked to preserve relationships with his 2 older, adopted children, Isabella and Connor, both of whom remained connected to Scientology into their own adulthood. Unlike their younger half-sister, Isabella has pursued a quiet career as an artist and largely stayed out of public view, occasionally denying any real distance between herself and her parents despite their notable absence from her own wedding. Connor, meanwhile, has dabbled in acting and DJ work and was photographed with his father in 2019 sharing a helicopter ride in London, a small but telling glimpse of the kind of bond that still exists between Cruz and the children who remained within his belief system. Suri, by contrast, grew up almost entirely under Katie's guidance, largely shielded from spotlight, developing a creative streak of her own along the way, lending her voice to 2 of her mother's independent film projects, including a song featured in one release from 2022 and vocals contributed to another from 2023. Katie has spoken warmly about including her daughter in that creative work, describing the collaboration in interviews as something deeply meaningful to her personally, a way of building something together rather than simply coexisting under one roof. When Suri graduated high school this past June, family and friends surrounded her in New York City to celebrate the milestone, a low-key but clearly joyful occasion by most accounts. Her father was not among them. Reports placed him instead at a high-profile pop concert that same season, socializing backstage with other celebrities in a VIP setting, a contrast that didn't go unnoticed by anyone paying close attention to the overlapping timeline, and one that reignited years of speculation about just how distant the relationship between father and daughter had actually become. Then came the moment that actually sparked the headlines you've probably seen circulating recently. After turning 18, Suri made a quiet but unmistakable decision. She began using her mother's middle name as her own surname, stepping away from the Cruz name entirely in her personal and academic life. It wasn't announced with a press release or a sit-down interview explaining her reasoning. It surfaced simply, the way most of Suri's life has unfolded over the past decade, privately, deliberately, and clearly on her own terms rather than anyone else's. Sources close to the family have suggested it reflects where her sense of identity and loyalty genuinely lies after 18 years of watching one parent show up consistently and the other remain largely absent. It's worth pausing on just how significant a decision like that actually is for a teenager stepping into adulthood, a decision that carries real emotional weight without needing a single dramatic public statement to explain itself. Around the same time, she committed to Carnegie Mellon University, moving out to Pittsburgh to begin college life, while her mother adjusted to an empty New York apartment for the first time in 18 years, a transition Katie has described in interviews with a mix of pride and quiet sadness. The two have remained remarkably close throughout this transition, with Suri returning to New York on weekends to support Katie's Broadway debut this past fall, and the pair continuing to be photographed together in the kind of easy, coordinated street style that suggests a genuinely close relationship rather than a performed one for cameras. Katie has been open in interviews about how meaningful that closeness is to her, describing her daughter in one recent conversation as an incredible, grounded young person, and expressing gratitude for the chance to protect her from the kind of intense early exposure to fame that Katie herself never fully escaped as a young actress. As for Tom, he's remained focused on his own next chapter, one that looks almost nothing like the quiet, private life his daughter has built for herself. He's currently tied to another installment in his long-running action franchise, continuing to perform his own increasingly dangerous stunts well into his 60s, a commitment to physical risk that has become as much a part of his public identity as any specific role. He's also reportedly developing an ambitious film project set partly aboard the International Space Station, working alongside major players in the private aerospace industry, an undertaking that would make him one of the first actors to shoot footage in orbit. It's an enormous, headline-grabbing pursuit, the kind of project that guarantees months of coverage regardless of whether it fully comes together. And it stands in almost deliberate contrast to the understated, deliberately private life his daughter has chosen instead. Two very different lives, in other words, moving in almost opposite directions. One built around global blockbusters, orbital ambitions, and a public persona sustained for decades. The other built around quiet independence, a small circle of trust, and a college dorm room in Pittsburgh. Whether those two paths ever intersect again in any meaningful way is something only time, and perhaps Suri herself will eventually decide. And if the last decade is any indication, that decision will likely be made quietly, privately, and entirely on her own terms, the same way nearly everything else in her adult life has begun. It's worth stepping back for a moment to consider just how unusual this entire situation actually is, even by the standards of Hollywood families, which are rarely ordinary to begin with. Most celebrity children who grow up estranged from a famous parent still tend to cross paths occasionally, whether at industry events, mutual family gatherings, or simply because the entertainment world is smaller than it looks from the outside. Suri's situation reads differently. A gap of more than a decade without a single confirmed public sighting between father and daughter is rare even among the most acrimonious celebrity separations, and it suggests something more structural than simple scheduling conflicts or busy careers. Custody arrangements can certainly explain the early years, when Suri was still a young child and Katie held sole legal authority over where she went and who she spent time with. But as Suri moved through her teenage years, old enough to make her own choices about visits and phone calls, the continued distance suggests the separation had become something closer to a settled pattern than a temporary legal restriction. Whether that pattern reflects Suri's own preferences, lingering tension from the divorce, incompatible schedules, or some combination of all three is something neither party has addressed directly in public. And that silence itself has become part of the story, filled in over the years by speculation from journalists, former Scientology members, and casual observers alike. What's clear is that Katie built an entire childhood and adolescence for her daughter almost entirely without Tom's day-to-day presence. And by most visible measures, it worked. Suri appears grounded, creatively engaged, and close to her mother in ways that many children of high-profile divorces never quite managed to achieve. There's also a broader context worth considering here, one that extends beyond this single family and into the way Scientology itself has historically handled the departure of members, particularly public figures. Former members who've spoken out over the years have described a practice, sometimes referred to as disconnection, in which the church encourages followers to cut ties with friends or family members who leave or openly criticize the organization. While there's no confirmed evidence that this specific practice directly shaped the relationship between Cruz and his daughter, the broader pattern has fueled ongoing public speculation about why so many prominent departures from the actor's inner circle, romantic or otherwise, have ended in near total silence, rather than the more typical messy, occasionally in-touch dynamic of most celebrity breakups. Katie herself has never publicly attributed the distance between Tom and Suri to the church directly, and Cruz, for his part, has pushed back firmly whenever interviewers or legal questioners have implied that his faith was something his own daughter needed protecting from. What both parties seem to agree on, at least implicitly, is that Suri's upbringing unfolded almost entirely outside of Scientology's influence, a fact confirmed by Cruz himself under oath. For a religion that has historically placed enormous emphasis on family loyalty and generational continuity, having one of its most famous adherents raise a daughter with no meaningful exposure to its teachings is, on its own, a striking footnote to this entire story. Meanwhile, Katie's own transformation since the divorce has become almost as compelling a story as her daughter's, even if it's received considerably less attention. The woman who once described feeling unable to leave her own house without being swarmed has spent the years since building a career on her own terms, moving from acting into directing, taking on independent film projects that let her control the creative process from start to finish rather than simply showing up to deliver lines written by someone else. She's spoken about that shift as something genuinely liberating, describing in interviews the sense of empowerment that came from putting her own work into the world without needing anyone else's approval first. Her dating life after the divorce came with its own unusual restriction, a 5-year period during which she was contractually barred from publicly acknowledging any new relationship, a condition that meant her years-long relationship with actor Jamie Foxx played out almost entirely outside public view until long after it had ended. She since described that chapter of her life as one that helped her rediscover a sense of independence she felt she'd lost somewhere in the middle of her marriage, a lightness in how she talks about herself, now that stands in noticeable contrast to the more guarded, careful version of Katie Holmes that friends described during her years with Cruise. It's tempting to read her post-divorce life as simply the story of an escape, but it reads more accurately as a slow, deliberate rebuilding, one that happened to include raising a teenager at the exact same time, a task she's clearly approached with as much intention as her own career. As Suri settles into her first year at Carnegie Mellon, the story her family has generated over the past 2 decades has quietly shifted shape. What began as a tabloid romance defined by a couch-jumping outburst and a fairy tale wedding has become, almost 2 decades later, a story about a young woman quietly and deliberately defining herself on her own terms, name change included. There's no dramatic confrontation here, no tell-all interview, no public reckoning between estranged father and adult daughter. Just a name, a college acceptance, a mother-daughter bond that's held steady through years most families would have found impossible to survive intact, and a father whose path has simply run parallel rather than intersecting. Whether that changes in the years ahead, now that Suri is old enough to make first contact entirely on her own initiative, if she ever chooses to, remains one of the more quietly compelling open questions in modern celebrity culture, precisely because nobody involved has shown any interest in resolving it for an audience. There's an interesting symmetry, too, in how differently each parent has chosen to handle public attention over the years, a contrast that says a lot about the 2 very different worlds Suri was pulled between as a child. Tom Cruise built his entire adult identity around visibility, around the idea that bigger is always better, whether that means a bigger stunt, a bigger premiere, or a bigger public gesture of affection on a talk show couch. Katie Holmes, by contrast, seems to have spent the years since her divorce actively moving in the opposite direction, trading red carpets for film sets she controls behind the camera, and trading tabloid romance for a private, unhurried dating life that she only discusses on her own terms, years after the fact. It's not hard to see which model Suri appears to have absorbed more directly. Everything about how she's approached turning 18, the quiet name change, the understated college announcement, the total absence of interviews or statements explaining her choices, mirrors her mother's more recent instinct toward privacy far more than it mirrors her father's lifelong comfort with the spotlight. That's not necessarily a judgment on either parent, so much as an observation about which environment actually shaped her daily life for the past 12 years. Tom Cruise, whatever his private feelings toward his daughter, was largely a name in headlines and old photographs to her, while Katie was the parent present for school drop-offs, film sets, dorm move-in day, and every ordinary moment in between that never made it into a magazine. It's also worth acknowledging how differently this story might have unfolded had Suri grown up in almost any other era of celebrity culture, one without smartphones capturing every sighting, without social media accounts dissecting every outfit choice, without entertainment outlets treating a college decision or a surname change as breaking news. Children of extremely famous parents have historically had at least some ability to grow up outside of constant scrutiny once the initial fascination with their birth faded. Suri never really got that luxury. She was photographed as an infant in her mother's arms before she could walk, dressed in headline-generating outfits before she could talk, and analyzed for any sign of resemblance to either parent before she developed a personality of her own to compare. That she's emerged from all of that as what friends and family describe as a grounded, creatively engaged, fiercely independent young woman says something meaningful about the environment Katie worked to build around her, even under constant external pressure. It also helps explain why a decision as simple as adjusting her legal surname generated the kind of attention it did. For most 18-year-olds, that's an entirely private, administrative choice. For Suri, it became a headline not because the decision itself was dramatic, but because everything involving her family has been treated as newsworthy since the day she was born, whether she asked for that attention or not. Looking back over the full arc of this story, from a teenage magazine confession about a celebrity crush to a Broadway opening night nearly 2 decades later, what stands out most isn't the scandal, the couch-jumping headlines, or even the divorce settlement details that once dominated entertainment coverage for weeks on end. It's a quieter through-line underneath all of it. A mother and daughter who built something durable together, almost entirely outside the version of Hollywood family life that gets turned into headlines. And a father whose relationship with that same daughter remains, by every visible account, unresolved. There's no dramatic villain in this version of the story, no single moment that explains everything definitively. Just a series of choices, legal arrangements, and quiet decisions that added up, year after year, into the family dynamic that exists today. Suri Cruise didn't ask to be born into one of the most heavily documented relationships in modern entertainment history, and she certainly didn't ask for her name, her college choice, or her friendships to become subjects of public analysis. But in choosing how she steps into adulthood, quietly, deliberately, and almost entirely on her own terms, she's arguably done more to define her own story in the past few months than nearly 2 decades of tabloid coverage managed to do about her parents combined. What comes next, whether that's a reconciliation with her father someday or simply more of the private, self-directed life she's already building, remains entirely hers to decide, and for the first time in her life, entirely outside anyone else's control.